The glass doors of Royce Elite Motors slid open with a smooth hush, revealing a showroom bathed in bright, pristine lighting. The air was thick with the rich scent of polished leather and fresh wax, a signature aroma of wealth and exclusivity. Under the sleek LED lights, Lamborghini Aventadors, Aston Martin DBS Superleggeras, and Rolls-Royce Phantoms gleamed like trophies, powerful machines waiting to be claimed by their next millionaire owner. Wealthy businessmen, tech moguls, and trust fund heirs gathered near the espresso bar, engaged in passionate discussions about V12 engines, carbon fiber finishes, and custom interiors. Meanwhile, a man stepped inside Keanu Reeves. But unlike the showroom's usual clientele, he wasn't dressed in a tailored suit or sporting a six-figure watch. Instead, he wore a faded hoodie, worn-out jeans, and old sneakers. No one gave him a second glance. No one realized that this man had driven nearly every hypercar ever made. Keanu strolled through the showroom with his hands tucked in his pockets, his gaze sweeping over the vehicles. He wasn't gawking like an outsider dreaming of luxury. He was assessing them with the quiet understanding of someone who knew their worth better than the salespeople themselves. But Keanu wasn't here to buy a car. He already owned them all. What made this moment interesting was that no one in the room knew it, and Keanu had no plans to announce it just yet. Instead, he waited, watching to see who would judge him purely by his appearance, a test he had seen play out far too many times before. Across the showroom, Jack Wilson, one of the top salesmen at Royce Elite Motors, adjusted the Rolex on his wrist and took a casual sip of his double-shot espresso. Business had been good today. He had already secured a deposit on a Ferrari SF90 from a young tech entrepreneur and was working on upselling a custom Rolls-Royce to an oil magnate's son. Jack thrived in this environment, where wealth spoke louder than words, where designer suits, luxury watches, and status symbols determined who deserved his attention. That's when he spotted Keanu Reeves. Jack's trained eyes scanned him quickly. Faded hoodie, worn-out jeans, beat-up sneakers. No watch, no visible designer labels, no entourage. Just some guy wandering around like a lost tourist, Jack smirked. He had seen this before. Every now and then, a dreamer would walk in, snapping selfies next to million-dollar cars, fantasizing about a life they could never afford. Jack set his espresso down, straightened his suit jacket, and made his way over. "Excuse me, sir," he said smoothly, his salesman smile polished but empty. "Can I help you with something?" His tone already carried an assumption. "You don't belong here." Keanu turned, his expression relaxed and unreadable. "Yeah," he said, glancing toward a matte black Lamborghini Aventador on display. The car's aggressive lines made it look like it was roaring even at a standstill. "I'd love to take that one for a test drive." Jack's smile flickered, then returned just as quickly. He let out a small, patronizing chuckle. "That's a fantastic car," he said, crossing his arms. But, it's not really a test drive kind of vehicle." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "No test drives?" Jack hesitated before choosing his words carefully. "Not without pre-qualification, you understand. We don't just hand over $500,000 supercars without certain assurances." Keanu let that hang in the air for a moment, studying the salesman's expression. He had seen this type before. People who measured worth by appearance rather than character. "So," Keanu said after a beat, "how exactly do you pre-qualify someone like me?" Jack's gaze flickered down to Keanu's hoodie, jeans, and shoes. There was nothing about him that screamed money. No gold-plated credit cards, no custom-tailored suit, no air of Wall Street arrogance. Just a guy who, to Jack, probably couldn't even afford a used Toyota Corolla. "Well, Jack started, forcing a polite tone. "These vehicles start in the six-figure range. We typically cater to a certain type of clientele." Keanu let out a quiet chuckle, hands still in his pockets. "A certain type?" he repeated, amusement flickering in his voice. Jack nodded tightly. "I just don't want to waste your time. We do have some more affordable options over here." He gestured toward the far end of the showroom, where a row of pre-owned vehicles sat in a dimly lit corner, a graveyard for cars that no longer belonged in the spotlight. Keanu's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. He glanced at Jack, then back at the Lamborghini Aventador. "So just to be clear," Keanu said slowly, "you're saying I don't look like someone who could afford that car?" For the first time, Jack's confidence wavered. "I wouldn't say that," he replied, forcing a nervous chuckle. Mia, it's unusual for someone to ask for a test drive without certain qualifications. Keanu nodded as if absorbing the information. He could have ended this right here. One phone call and Jack's entire reality would flip upside down. But Keanu wasn't here to flex his wealth. He was here to see people for who they really were. "All right," he said simply, stepping back. Jack gave a satisfied nod, assuming that was the end of it. But Keanu didn't leave. Instead, he started walking around the showroom, running his fingers lightly over the polished hoods of Ferraris, McLarens, and Aston Martins, inspecting each car with the kind of care that serious buyers, real buyers, had. Jack watched, his jaw tightening slightly. This guy wasn't leaving, and worse, other customers had started noticing. Jack Wilson watched Keanu Reeves with growing unease. The man in the faded hoodie and worn-out sneakers wasn't leaving. Instead, he wandered the showroom with the kind of confidence Jack associated with serious buyers. The ones who didn't need financing, who could wire transfer $500,000 on the spot. But that didn't make sense. People with real money dressed the part, tailored suits, Rolex watches, designer shoes. That was the game. That was how you separated the dreamers from the doers. And Keanu, in Jack's eyes, was clearly a dreamer. Jack forced himself to remain composed, but something about the way Keanu moved, the way he ran his fingers along the polished hoods of a Ferrari SF90, a McLaren P1, unnerved him. Keanu wasn't gawking like a tourist. He was assessing, calculating. And that made Jack deeply uncomfortable. Across the room, a young sales associate, Mike Carter, was watching everything unfold. Unlike Jack, Mike recognized Keanu instantly. He'd seen the interviews, the viral clips, the stories of Keanu's humility and generosity. He knew exactly who this man was. But he stayed quiet, not because he wanted to, but because he wanted to see how far Jack would take this. Jack, meanwhile, decided to end this distraction. He adjusted his Rolex and strode forward, past the murmuring customers and curious glances from the other employees. "Sure," Jack called out, forcing an easy chuckle. "If you're not looking to make a purchase today, I do have other clients to attend to." Keanu turned, tilting his head slightly. "You seem pretty eager to get rid of me." Jack let out another hollow laugh. "Not at all," he lied. "I just like to prioritize serious buyers." There it was, the assumption, the judgment, the unspoken but crystal clear message: you don't belong here. Keanu let the silence stretch, watching Jack shift uncomfortably. Then, without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "What?" Jack's smirk returned slightly. He thought he had won. Maybe Keanu was calling a bank? A friend? Someone to vouch for him? Whatever it was, Jack had already decided it wouldn't change a thing. And then, the showroom door swung open. A sharply dressed man in a tailored navy blue suit strode in, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. His eyes scanned the room for barely a second before locking onto Keanu and immediately breaking into a wide smile. "Mr. Reeves," the man called out, striding over with a handshake already extended. "I didn't know you'd be visiting today." Jack's smirk vanished, his stomach dropped. Because the man walking toward them wasn't just any executive. He was Daniel Foster, the regional director of Royce Elite Motors, Jack's boss's boss. Jack's throat tightened. He glanced at Keanu, then at Daniel, then back at Keanu. The casually dressed man he had just humiliated owned the entire dealership chain. Jack felt his pulse quicken as realization hit him like a tidal wave. He had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Jack Wilson stood frozen, his brain scrambling to process what had just happened. Daniel Foster, the regional director of Royce Elite Motors, had walked in and greeted Keanu Reeves like an old friend. Jack's stomach churned. He could feel the weight of 100 silent eyes on him, employees, customers, fellow salesmen, all watching the situation unfold. Keanu, still perfectly relaxed, slipped his phone back into his pocket and flashed an easy smile. "Yeah," he said simply. "That's me." Jack's mouth went dry. He had just treated the owner of the entire dealership chain like an unworthy customer. Daniel, still oblivious to Jack's growing panic, turned to Keanu with genuine warmth. "If we had known you were stopping by, we would have arranged something special for you." Keanu chuckled, his gaze flicking briefly toward Jack before he answered. "Oh, nothing special. Just wanted to see how things run around here when no one's watching." That's when it clicked. Daniel's friendly smile faltered slightly. His executive instincts kicked in as he followed Keanu's gaze straight to Jack. Jack suddenly felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff. Daniel's expression hardened. "Is there a problem?" Keanu sighed lightly, shaking his head, though there was an unmistakable edge to his voice. "Well, that depends," he said, turning fully toward Jack. "Apparently, test driving a Lamborghini requires pre-approval." The words hit the showroom like a thunderclap. Jack could feel the temperature in the room drop as Daniel's face darkened. "Pre-approval," Daniel repeated, his voice dangerously calm. Jack swallowed hard, his salesmanship instincts kicking in as he tried to recover. I was just following protocol," he stammered. We typically..." Jack flinched at the way Daniel said his name. Slow, deliberate, full of disappointment. "Do you have any idea who you're speaking to?" Jack opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing to say. No excuse that wouldn't sound exactly like what it was. Keanu let the silence stretch before finally breaking it. "I'm just curious," he said, tilting his head. "How did you decide I wasn't qualified to test drive that car?" Jack fumbled for words, but nothing came. He felt trapped, like a deer in headlights. Keanu turned, glancing at the matte black Lamborghini Aventador. "I've met a lot of people who assume things about others just by looking at them," he mused. "It's an interesting habit, but a dangerous one, don't you think?" Jack could feel his career crumbling in real time. Daniel folded his arms, his tone now clipped and professional. "Mr. Reeves owns this entire dealership chain, Jack." The weight of those words hit like a gut punch. A few feet away, Mike Carter, the young sales associate, shifted uncomfortably. He had recognized Keanu from the start but had been too hesitant to interfere. Now, watching Jack's downfall in real time, he felt a strange mix of satisfaction and regret. Jack's arrogance had just cost him everything. Jack Wilson stood there, his confidence shattered, his arrogance evaporated. The realization that he had just humiliated the owner of the entire dealership chain settled in like a heavy weight pressing against his chest. The once proud salesman who had always prided himself on reading people had just made the worst judgment call of his career. Keanu, still calm and composed, turned back to him with an expression that was impossible to read. "Serious buyers," he said, repeating Jack's earlier words. "That's funny, because I walked in here seriously interested in that car." Jack swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. "But instead of asking me what I wanted," Keanu continued, "you decided to tell me what I couldn't afford." A hush had fallen over the showroom. Every employee, every customer, hell, even the mechanics in the service bay, had stopped what they were doing to watch this unfold. It wasn't every day that a hotshot salesman got put in his place by the very man who signed his paychecks. Jack tried to recover, forcing a nervous chuckle. "Mr. Reeves, I didn't mean..." "Do it." Keanu's voice was calm but final, cutting through Jack's excuse like a razor. "And that's the problem." Jack's stomach churned. He wanted to crawl into the nearest luxury car and disappear. Daniel Foster, the regional director, had seen enough. His expression was one of deep disappointment as he turned to Jack, arms crossed. "Jack," he said, his voice sharp, "this is not how we treat customers. Ever." Jack opened his mouth, desperate for a defense, but nothing came. Keanu let out a quiet sigh and turned to Daniel. "Tell me," he said, nodding toward the showroom, "is this how customers are treated here? Or is this just a special privilege reserved for people who don't look the part?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Absolutely not," he said firmly, throwing a glare at Jack. "That is not how we operate." Keanu nodded slightly, then looked back at Jack. The silence stretched. Jack was scrambling, grasping for a way out, but there wasn't one. Finally, Keanu exhaled, shaking his head slightly as if he was done wasting his time. Then he turned to Daniel, hands still casually tucked in his pockets. "So what'd you think?" he asked. "Is this guy really the best person to represent your brand?" Jack felt the blood drain from his face. Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. "Jack," he said coldly, "we'll discuss your future here after this meeting." The finality in his tone sealed it. Jack stood there, motionless, humiliated, completely undone. Keanu, meanwhile, had already moved on. His gaze landed on Mike Carter, the younger, quieter salesman who had witnessed everything. Keanu nodded toward him. You, he said. What's your name? Mike straightened up immediately. Mike Carter, sir. Keanu smiled slightly. Mike, did you recognize me when I walked in? Mike hesitated, then nodded. Yes, sir. Keanu tilted his head. And yet, you didn't say anything. Mike looked away, clearly ashamed. I should have, he admitted. I just didn't want to step on any toes. Keanu studied him for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough, he said. But tell me, if you had been the one to greet me today, would you have treated me the same way Jack did? Mike didn't even hesitate. No, sir. Keanu's small smile returned. Good answer. He glanced at Daniel. This guy seems like he gets it. Daniel nodded. Mike's always been professional. Keanu exhaled, turning back to the cars, running his fingers along the hood of the matte black Lamborghini. I don't need a big speech, he said, but I do need to know that this dealership represents the right kind of people. Daniel nodded again, slowly. Keanu turned back to Mike. How'd you like a shot at a management role? Mike's eyes widened. Sir? Keanu shrugged casually. Seems to me you understand something Jack doesn't, and I'd rather have someone like you leading this place than someone who decides who's worthy based on their shoes. Mike was stunned. He glanced at Daniel, who gave him an approving nod. Jack, meanwhile, stood there, stiff with rage, his entire world unraveling before his eyes. Daniel finally turned back to Keanu. Mr. Reeves, I'll handle everything. You have my word. Keanu gave one last look at Jack, the man who had judged him based on nothing but his clothes and had now lost everything because of it. Then, with a relaxed clap of his hands, he said lightly, Well, that was fun. Now, about that test drive? Mike grinned. Absolutely, sir. Let me grab the keys. Jack could only watch, powerless, as the future he thought he controlled slipped right through his fingers. Jack Wilson stood frozen, his mind racing, heart pounding. In a single afternoon, he had gone from being one of the top salesmen at Royce Elite Motors to the dealership's biggest embarrassment. He had spent years perfecting the art of judging customers at a glance, deciding who was worth his time based on their clothes, their watch, their swagger. And yet here he was, outplayed, outclassed, and about to lose everything. Keanu Reeves, meanwhile, remained calm, composed, and utterly in control. He turned to Daniel Foster, the regional director, and asked the question that would seal Jack's fate. So what do you think? Keanu said, hands still in his pockets. Is this guy really the best person to represent your brand? Jack felt the blood drain from his face. Daniel let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable. Then finally he spoke. Jack, he said, we'll discuss your future here after this meeting. The words hit like a wrecking ball. The showroom was silent. The other employees, the customers, everyone was watching. Jack felt like the walls were closing in. But then, something unexpected happened. Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying Jack. There was no smugness in his expression, no gloating, just curiosity. Firing someone, Keanu said, that's easy. Too easy. Jack blinked. Wait. Daniel narrowed his eyes slightly, trying to figure out where Keanu was going with this. Keanu smirked and crossed his arms. So instead of kicking you out today, Jack, I'm going to give you an opportunity. The entire room held its breath. Jack felt a flicker of hope. Was he really getting a second chance? Keanu gestured toward the far side of the showroom, where the pre-owned cars sat collecting dust, the same section Jack had so smugly tried to send Keanu to earlier. You're going to work over there now, Keanu said smoothly. And for the next 6 months, every car you sell, a percentage of your commission is going into a customer assistance fund to help real people get the financing they need. Jack's mouth fell open. Daniel raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. That's an interesting proposal. Jack couldn't hold back anymore. Are you kidding me? He blurted out. You want me to, sell used cars to bargain shoppers? You're basically demoting me to... Keanu's eyes darkened slightly. To the kind of customers you just tried to send me to, he finished for him. Jack snapped his mouth shut. Yeah, that's what he thought. For the first time, Jack looked truly lost. He turned to Daniel, hoping for some kind of reprieve. Daniel didn't budge. Mr. Reeves is the owner of this dealership chain, he said simply. If this is his decision, then that's what we're doing. Jack's hands curled into fists. He had no choice. Either swallow his pride or walk out with nothing. The silence in the room was deafening. Keanu studied him for a long moment, then shrugged casually. Or, he said, you can leave. And just like that, Jack's entire future was put in his own hands. He stood there, humiliated, defeated, but ultimately trapped. After what felt like an eternity, Jack exhaled sharply and nodded stiffly. Fine, he muttered, his voice bitter. I'll take the transfer. Keanu grinned. Great choice, he said. You'll learn a lot over there. Daniel motioned for Jack to leave, and with one final glare, Jack turned on his heel and walked away. His once bright future, now uncertain at best. As soon as he was gone, the energy in the showroom shifted. The tension that had gripped the room lifted like a heavy fog. Keanu turned to Mike Carter, the young salesman who had watched everything unfold. So, Mike, he said, you got the keys? Mike snapped to attention. Yes, sir, ready when you are. Keanu's lips curled into an easy smile. Then let's go for a ride. And with that, the lesson was over. But the real work was just beginning. As Jack Wilson disappeared toward the pre-owned section, the tension in the showroom finally lifted. Employees exchanged glances, customers whispered among themselves, and the air, once heavy with awkwardness, now felt different. Lighter, as if something fundamental had shifted in the culture of Royce Elite Motors. But Keanu Reeves wasn't done yet. He turned back toward Mike Carter, the young salesman who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, observing rather than interfering. Keanu had seen something in him. Not arrogance, not entitlement, but potential. Who, Mike? Keanu said casually. You got the keys? Mike snapped to attention, his posture instinctively straightening. Yes, sir. Ready when you are. Keanu's lips curled into an easy smile, but instead of walking straight to the car, he tilted his head slightly, studying the young man. Let me ask you something, Keanu said. Did you recognize me when I walked in? Mike hesitated for a beat, then nodded. Yes, sir. Keanu raised an eyebrow. And yet, you didn't say anything. Mike looked down for a moment, clearly ashamed. I should have, he admitted. But I didn't want to step on any toes. Keanu nodded slowly as if considering that response. Fair enough, he said. But let me ask you something else. If you had been the one to greet me today, would you have treated me the way Jack did? Mike didn't even hesitate. No, sir. Keanu's smile returned. Good answer. Mike exhaled, his shoulders relaxing just a little, as if realizing that his honesty had been the right call. Keanu then glanced over at Daniel Foster, the regional director, who had been watching everything unfold. This guy, Keanu said, nodding toward Mike. Seems like he gets it. Daniel folded his arms, studying Mike more carefully now. Mike's always been professional, he admitted, though there was a hint of newfound respect in his voice. Keanu exhaled lightly, turning back toward the matte black Lamborghini Aventador he had originally asked to test drive. I don't need a big speech, he said, but I do need to know that this dealership represents the right kind of people. Daniel nodded, slower this time, understanding the deeper meaning behind Keanu's words. This wasn't just about Jack. It was about the entire culture of the showroom. Then, as if making a split-second decision, Keanu turned back to Mike. How you like a shot at a management role? Mike's eyes widened in shock. Keanu shrugged casually, as if offering a cup of coffee rather than a career-changing opportunity. Seems to me you understand something Jack doesn't, and I'd rather have someone like you leading this place than someone who decides who's worthy based on their shoes. For a second, Mike couldn't even process what was happening. He looked to Daniel, who gave him an approving nod, the kind of nod that said, this is real, this is happening. Mike started, struggling to find the right words. Then finally, he straightened up and nodded. I'd be honored, sir. Keanu grinned. Good, then let's get that test drive. Mike couldn't hide his excitement anymore. He nearly sprinted to grab the keys, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline of the moment. Meanwhile, Jack, now standing among the pre-owned cars, watched the scene unfold from a distance. His replacement had already been chosen. Keanu had made his decision. This wasn't just about removing the wrong person, it was about elevating the right one. And for Mike Carter, this was just the beginning of something much, much bigger. Mike Carter's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the keys to the matte black Lamborghini Aventador. Just moments ago, he had been a junior salesman watching from the sidelines. Now, he was about to hand over the keys to a man who had just changed his entire career trajectory. Keanu Reeves, as calm as ever, flashed an easy grin. "You ready?" Mike nodded quickly. "Absolutely, sir." As they stepped toward the sleek, powerful machine, the tension that had once filled the showroom was long gone. Employees who had once stood frozen in shock were now buzzing with excitement. Conversations had shifted from murmured gossip about Jack's downfall to excitement about what had just happened. Keanu had come in, challenged everything they thought they knew, and walked out having changed the game. As Keanu slid into the driver's seat, he adjusted the rearview mirror, his fingers lightly drumming against the steering wheel. Mike climbed into the passenger seat, still half in disbelief. Keanu turned to him. "You ever been in one of these?" Mike shook his head, his adrenaline spiking. "No, sir." Keanu smirked. "First time for everything?" With that, he pressed the ignition button. The Aventador roared to life, its deep, guttural growl vibrating through the entire showroom. The sound alone was enough to command attention. Every head in the dealership turned toward them as the engine revved, the raw power of the V12 echoing off the walls. Even the mechanics from the service bay poked their heads out, drawn by the unmistakable sound of a $500,000 machine awakening. Jack Wilson, now exiled to the pre-owned section, looked over. His jaw clenched as he watched Keanu and Mike about to take off in a car he had denied Keanu just minutes earlier. Keanu shifted into first gear, giving the gas pedal a light tap. The Lamborghini lurched forward effortlessly, ready to unleash every bit of the 740 horsepower under its hood. Just as they were about to pull out, Daniel Foster tapped on the driver's side window. Keanu rolled it down smoothly, raising an eyebrow. "Before you go," Daniel said, his tone calm but loaded with meaning, "I just wanted to say, appreciate how you handled that back there." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "You mean not firing him on the spot?" Daniel smirked. "Something like that," he exhaled, shaking his head. "Jack's been here a long time, but his ego got the better of him. He forgot that this business isn't just about selling cars, it's about understanding people." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, a lot of people make that mistake." He let the words settle before adding, "But mistakes don't define people. What they do next does." Daniel studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Well, if Jack's smart, he'll take this as a wake-up call." Keanu glanced toward the showroom where Jack stood, arms crossed, frustration written all over his face. "We'll see," he said simply. Daniel straightened his tie. "So, where are you headed?" Keanu smirked, tapping his fingers against the wheel. "Oh, just taking a serious test drive." Daniel chuckled. "Just don't go too easy on it." Keanu rolled the window back up, threw the Lambo into gear, and let it rip. The Aventador screeched out of the showroom, the tires gripping the pavement like claws as it launched onto the main road with effortless power. Mike let out an involuntary laugh, his body pressing against the seat from the sheer force of the acceleration. "Holy," he started, gripping the dashboard for balance. Keanu, completely unfazed, barely glanced over. "Too fast for you." Mike exhaled, shaking his head. "No way," he grinned. "I've just never been in a car like this before." Keanu smiled faintly, shifting gears as they weaved through the streets of downtown Los Angeles. The late afternoon sun bounced off the Lamborghini's flawless paint, turning heads at every intersection. Pedestrians stopped mid-step. Drivers craned their necks, drawn to the unmistakable sound of wealth and power rolling through the city. But for Keanu, this wasn't about power. It was about principle. The Aventador glided onto an open stretch of road, and Keanu let the engine roar as he accelerated. The thrill of speed was undeniable, but his mind was still on what had just happened in that showroom. The way people judge others based on nothing but surface-level impressions. After a few minutes of comfortable silence, Mike finally spoke. "It was probably the most satisfying thing I've ever seen." Keanu smirked, keeping his eyes on the road. Mike nodded. "I've worked there for almost 3 years," he said, "and Jack, he's always been like that. Looking down on people, deciding who's worth his time and who isn't, and the worst part, he got away with it." Keanu's fingers flexed slightly around the steering wheel. Well, today. Mike exhaled. Exactly. He glanced over. I know you're giving him a second chance, but honestly, I don't think he deserves it. Keanu was quiet for a moment, then shrugged lightly. Maybe, he said. But here's the thing. People don't change unless they're forced to. And I just forced him into the exact position he used to look down on. Mike thought about that for a second. Then he let out a laugh. You know, that's kind of brilliant. Keanu grinned. We'll see. They continued driving, weaving through the golden hour glow of the city, past Hollywood Boulevard, Sunset Strip, and finally looping back toward the dealership. By the time they returned, the sun had begun to dip below the skyline, casting a warm orange hue across Royce Elite Motors. As Keanu pulled into the parking lot, slowing the Aventador to a smooth stop, Mike exhaled sharply, still buzzing from the experience. It was insane. Keanu chuckled, unbuckling his seatbelt. Not bad, huh? Mike grinned. I'll be talking about this for the rest of my life. Keanu smirked. Well, he said, pushing open the car door. Better make it a good story then. As Keanu Reeves and Mike Carter stepped out of the matte black Lamborghini Aventador, the dealership felt different. Not just in atmosphere, but in culture. A shift had occurred. Something subtle yet undeniable. Mike still had the buzz of adrenaline running through him as he parked the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel with the kind of excitement and respect that came from understanding what this moment truly meant. Keanu stretched his shoulders, rolling out the tension from the past hour. It had been unexpected, entertaining, but most of all, Daniel Foster, the regional director, was already waiting for them near the entrance, arms crossed, observing the dealership floor like a general surveying his troops. Oh, Daniel said, raising an eyebrow. How was the test drive? Keanu grinned. Not bad. But I think the real test starts now. Daniel nodded knowingly, following Keanu's gaze toward the showroom floor. Inside, Jack Wilson was still standing near the pre-owned section, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. He hadn't stormed out, he hadn't quit. That, at the very least, meant something. You think he'll learn? Daniel asked, keeping his voice low. Keanu exhaled slowly, watching Jack for a moment before answering. Honestly? No idea. Daniel smirked slightly. And if he doesn't? Keanu's lips twitched into a small, knowing smile. Then he's gone. Daniel studied him, then nodded. That was fair. Some people took second chances and ran with them. Others squandered them. Jack's next moves were entirely up to him now. A few feet away, Mike Carter re-entered the dealership, his expression still glowing from the experience. He wasn't just a junior salesman anymore. He was a man with a shot at something bigger, and he knew it. Daniel noticed this too and gave Keanu a glance. He made the right call with him, by the way. Keanu smiled slightly. Yeah, I think so too. Inside the dealership, employees were still processing what had happened. The ones who had been quietly nodding along to Jack's arrogance for years now had something to think about. They had seen what happens when the wrong person is in charge, and when the right person gets a chance. The energy had changed. The dealership wasn't perfect yet, but it was on its way. Keanu took one last look around. The cars gleamed under the bright showroom lights. The sales team was working with renewed focus. Even the customers seemed to sense the shift, engaged in conversation rather than feeling like they were being sized up. He nodded slightly, satisfied. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks. Well, he said, that was productive. Keanu chuckled. That's one way to put it? Daniel shook his head. You know, when you first bought this place, I wasn't sure how involved you'd actually be. Most owners just sit back and let the numbers roll in. Keanu turned to him, his expression thoughtful. I don't like doing things halfway. Daniel smirked. Clearly. He exhaled, shaking his head. And the way you handled Jack, that was brilliant. Keanu shrugged lightly. I've met a lot of guys like him. Some learn, some don't. Either way, he's going to have to figure out who he wants to be now. Daniel nodded. Well, whether he realizes it or not, you just gave him the biggest opportunity of his career. Keanu's gaze flicked back toward the glass showroom, where Jack was now talking to a customer. A middle-aged man wearing faded jeans and a flannel jacket. The kind of guy Jack would have ignored just hours ago. Mike, standing nearby, noticed it too. He frowned slightly, watching as Jack actually engaged in conversation, nodding instead of dismissing. Ha, Mike muttered. Would you look at that? Keanu smirked. Told you. Progress. Mike let out a laugh, shaking his head. Unreal. Daniel crossed his arms, still watching. If he actually pulls this off, he admitted, he might just turn into a decent salesman. Keanu clapped him on the shoulder. Well, if not, I'm sure we'll be having another conversation soon. Daniel chuckled. I'm sure. The three men stood there for a moment, letting the night settle around them. The hum of the city, the quiet murmur of the dealership staff, the distant roar of a supercar on the freeway. Finally, Keanu let out a slow breath. All right, he said, stretching slightly. I think my work here is done. Mike grinned. So what's next? Buying another dealership? Keanu laughed. Nah, I think I'll let this one marinate for a bit. He stepped toward his SUV, pausing just before opening the door. Besides, he added with a wink, I like keeping people on their toes. Daniel and Mike exchanged amused glances as Keanu slid into the driver's seat. He rolled down the window one last time. Take care of this place, yeah? Daniel gave him a firm nod. You have my word. Mike saluted playfully. Don't worry. If Jack slips up again, I'll be right there to remind him of today. Keanu chuckled. Good men. With that, he put the car into drive, rolling slowly out of the parking lot. The soft hum of the engine faded into the night, leaving behind a dealership that had just begun its transformation. Mike let out a slow breath, looking around. The air felt lighter, the energy renewed. Inside, Jack was still talking to the man in the flannel jacket, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't just selling, he was listening. Maybe this really was the start of something new. Keanu Reeves stepped outside into the cool night air, taking a deep breath as he let the events of the day settle in. The tension that had once thickened the air inside Royce Elite Motors had lifted, replaced by something lighter, something different. The dealership wasn't just a place that sold luxury cars anymore. It had just become a place where character mattered. Through the glass showroom windows, Keanu could still see the team inside. Employees had moved on, customers were still browsing, and mechanics in the service bay continued their work. On the surface, it looked like just another night at a high-end dealership. But it wasn't. Not for Jack Wilson. Jack still stood near the pre-owned section, his arms no longer crossed in defiance, his expression no longer filled with arrogance. He wasn't pouting, wasn't making excuses, he was thinking. Processing. Keanu smirked slightly. That was progress. A few feet away, Mike Carter stepped up beside him, glancing back through the windows. You really think he'll change? Mike asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. Keanu exhaled slowly, tucking his hands into his jacket pockets. Maybe, he said. Maybe not. But at least now he knows what it feels like to be on the other side. Mike nodded, then let out a small laugh. Gotta say, I've worked here for years and I've never seen anything like that. Keanu chuckled. Yeah, me neither. From across the parking lot, Daniel Foster, the regional director, joined them, adjusting his cufflinks as he took one last look at the dealership. As Dahl said, glancing at Keanu, that was productive. Keanu grinned. That's one way to put it. Daniel shook his head, still processing. You know, when you first bought this place, I wasn't sure how involved you'd actually be. Most owners just sit back and let the numbers roll in. Keanu turned to him, his expression thoughtful. I don't like doing things halfway. Daniel smirked. Clearly, he let out a breath, shaking his head. And the way you handled Jack? That was brilliant. Keanu shrugged. I've met a lot of guys like him. Some learn, some don't. Either way, he's gonna have to figure out who he wants to be now. Daniel crossed his arms. Well, whether he realizes it or not, you just gave him the biggest opportunity of his career. Keanu's eyes flicked back toward the showroom. Inside, Jack was now talking to a customer. A middle-aged man in faded jeans and a flannel jacket. The kind of guy Jack would have ignored just hours ago. Mike noticed it too. Would you look at that, he muttered. Keanu smirked. Told you. Progress. Mike let out a laugh, shaking his head. Unreal. Daniel folded his arms. If he actually pulls this off, he might just turn into a decent salesman. Keanu clapped him on the shoulder. Well, if not, I'm sure we'll be having another conversation soon. Daniel chuckled. I'm sure. The three men stood there for a moment, letting the night settle around them. The hum of the city, the quiet murmur of the dealership staff, the distant roar of a supercar on the freeway. Finally, Keanu let out a slow breath. "All right," he said, stretching slightly. "I think my work here is done." Mike grinned. "So what's next? Buying another dealership?" Keanu laughed. "Nah, I think I'll let this one marinate for a bit." He stepped toward his SUV, pausing just before opening the door. "Besides," he added with a wink, "I like keeping people on their toes." Daniel and Mike exchanged amused glances as Keanu slid into the driver's seat. He rolled down the window one last time. "Take care of this place, yeah?" Daniel gave him a firm nod. "You have my word." Mike saluted playfully. "Don't worry. If Jack slips up again, I'll be right there to remind him of today." Keanu chuckled. "Good man." With that, he put the car into drive, rolling slowly out of the parking lot. The soft hum of the engine faded into the night, leaving behind a dealership that had just begun its transformation. Mike let out a slow breath, looking around. The air felt lighter, the energy renewed. Inside, Jack was still talking to the man in the flannel jacket, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't just selling, he was listening. Maybe this really was the start of something new.